Welcome to the Gentleman Project Podcast. I'm Kirk Chugg.
And I'm Cory Moore. Today we have a long-term friend of mine, Jim, who is the president and owner of Sure Steel. Our companies have done business together for, I don't know how many years, Jim. A lot.
Oh, yeah, at least 17, 18 years or more.
Not only is he a fantastic business partner, but he is just super fun and really focuses on his family. We've talked family many times on multiple times. We've gone on trips and things like that. So I appreciate you being here, Jim. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you.
So with that, as we were discussing last night, I would have first start with kind of what made you who you are. Like, what kind of things did you learn growing up that kind of made Jim, Mr. Jim Burwell?
You're giving me far too much credit with the Mr. Jim Burwell, but what made me who I am, I can definitely say without a doubt, is my parents and the upbringing that I got. And with that said, I would like to share something with you as far as my philosophy on being a parent. My parents made sure that they were my parents first and my friends second. And you've probably heard similar things before, but when I got out of line, believe me, my parents let me know, and I was reprimanded, punished, spanked, you name it. That's what happened. And I never felt abused. I never felt anything like that. But what I did feel was loved. And at the end of the day, I think in some regards, many parents, not all, but many parents have kind of fallen away from that, and they've put being a friend first and not being a parent first. And I think that's where we kind of misstep in our society today. So for me personally, growing up being loved by parents was probably the biggest thing. And they were there to correct me when I got out of line, which happened quite a bit.
I like what you said, that, they punished and disciplined, but they did it, and you knew that they were always coming from a place of love, and it was never anything else.
Absolutely.
So I think that's the difference. The difference between a spanking and a beating is love, I guess you could say. And, for some of my kids, like a light swat or something like that, when they got out of line, was called for, and others didn't respond to that at all. For me personally. So I think you just have to kind of take a look at the kid and what their personality is, but obviously worked for you. You turned out.
I don't know about that. I'm still working on it. Yeah, I'm still growing.
You just wanted to use that the whole time.
I wanted to use that button.
Can I reach that? I gotta make sure I can reach that button. As an individual, you take what your parents did with you, you take the good things, and then you try to subscribe to that. And then you also take the good things that you witness in your friends' parents and other people, and you try to subscribe to that and bring that in and harness to be your own parent, right? Mm-hmm. And I think a smart man learns from his own mistakes. A wise man learns from the mistakes of everyone around him. And you got to be wise in being a parent. And you've heard this saying a million times: it takes a village to raise, a child. It really does. And we as parents got to humble ourselves to realize that just because our child gets in trouble doesn't mean an adult is wrong, whoever accused them of that, right? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, we need to say, oh, this is an adult. Maybe I should take their thoughts, their inspiration about the situation and take it to heart, instead of immediately just defending the child and saying, no, they couldn't have, it's my kid, they couldn't have done something wrong. And so really, we all need to work together and learn from each other.
Yeah. So I have two questions on that. Number one, how many kids do you have?
Yeah, three.
You have three kids. Can you tell us their ages?
Yeah. So my son's birthday is today. He's 24. Cool. Yeah. And he's engaged to get married in May, which is pretty cool.
Nice.
Yeah. I've got a 21-year-old daughter that's getting married in June.
Busy summer.
Yeah. And then I've got a senior in high school. She's 17.
Cool.
Yeah,
so as you say that, it takes a village to raise kids. Can you tell us an experience, or perhaps someone in your network that you say, these people were integral in helping me raise my kids or teach them lessons? Can you tell us who some of those people were, what some of those experiences were?
I'd probably like to reflect on my own life, actually. My dad and I were really close. And try not to get emotional telling you this, but we were really close, but there came a time in our life when we didn't see eye to eye. And through a church that I belonged to, I had an opportunity to meet a young men's leader that took an interest in me. And it was so cool that every week I would go see this gentleman, and he would take a personal interest. How are you doing? What's going on in your life? How's sports? This and that. And unfortunately, my dad and I got to the point where we butted heads so much that one day we actually got in a fight. And I'm not proud to say that. And we ended up actually striking each other. And it was a bad day. Okay. At the end of that day, I remember after we exchanged our scuffle, and I was 16 and a half years old, I left the house. He was hurt. I was hurt. It wasn't a good scenario. And I'm not proud of this, but there's a reason I'm sharing this. I came home that night about 10:30 at night. It was maybe 10:30, 11. I was scared. I thought, when I get in, I'm going to get the whooping of my life. I should have never, reached out and struck my father, and he felt the same way, I'm sure. I remember going into the kitchen, and I remember standing at the sink, getting a glass of water. I'd been playing a little bit of basketball with my friends, licking my wounds. And I remember the bedroom door open, and I could hear him walk down the hall, and there's one place where there's a squeak. You probably know what I'm talking about. And I thought, oh, here it comes. And I sat there holding my water, and I was shaking because I thought, this is it. This is where the rubber meets the road. And he grabbed my shoulder, and he turned me around, and I thought, he's just going to level me, because I had it coming. I really did. And he was crying, big time crying, out one eye, because his other eye was swollen shut. Not proud of that either. And gave me a big hug, and he asked for my forgiveness. And that was a turning point in our relationship. That day forward, we did everything together. We had a talk that night that lasted probably 2 hours. We shared experiences with each other, and where I was coming from, I got to tell him as a kid, this is how I'm feeling. He said, this is as a parent, this is how I'm feeling. And oddly enough, that brought us so close together that a couple of years later, my dad jokingly said, man, if I'd have known that's how it worked out, I'd have hit you twice.
Or a lot earlier.
Yeah, or a lot earlier. But at the end of the day, we had a great perspective from each other going forward, and a mutual respect. And it's terrible that incident had to lead to that. But what came of that was a relationship that lasted until the day he passed away, where we were close friends. We did it, as much as we possibly could together, between fishing and all the outdoor stuff that we like, and et cetera.
So thanks for sharing that. First of all, Jim, that was a cool story. So what did that teach you that you carried forward with your kid? Do you think about that when you've been raising your kids? Like, how do I have those moments without the physical interaction,
Oh yeah, for sure. And one thing that I stress to anybody that'll listen when they talk about raising kids is I have a 24-hour rule. If one of my children made a mistake, all they're going to get is a hug, and they're going to get me 24 hours to think about it, so that I can come from a place of being rational and not emotional. Because here's the thing with children, and you all know this, the fact of the matter is they look at how you respond to the situation. And if it's unfavorable right out the gate, guess what? They're not going to come talk to you anymore. If they come home and say, hey, I made this huge mistake, you give them a big hug, say, man, I sure love you. Thanks for sharing it. We'll talk in the morning.
That's a great rule.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, they'll tell you everything after that, because they know how you're going to respond. Even they know they made a mistake. And guess what? They'll punish themselves more than I can when you come from a place of being logical, not emotional. But it's so easy for parents just to get excited. In the world we live in right now, with like pornography and things like that are really warping the minds of youth, and with regards to intimacy. And mothers are the greatest. They're the greatest people on the planet. But here's the thing. If their son looks at pornography, guess what? They think, oh my gosh, my son's a pervert. Oh, my son has problems. Oh my goodness, what do I do? And the sons read that. They're never going to tell their mom anything like that again, when quite frankly, their mother is somebody who can really help them through something like that, to teach them what being a woman's all about, right? And so at the end of the day, it's how we respond to those kids. They are so smart, and they're reading everything, body language, emotion, frustration, everything. They're reading that. So we have to be very careful. So if we first show them love, and then we're going to have the right time, the next day we can sit down and say, look, okay, we really screwed up. So how are we going to fix this? And now you're a team member, and it just changes the perception.
That's going to be a new rule in my house now.
Yeah. I really like that.
For myself.
Well, it works miracle. You may hear more than you want after you've done it.
No, I like that. I try to show love first, but this idea of waiting tells the kid that, hey, and I know I'm going to respond totally different 24 hours later. In fact, there's many times where I've responded and then re-responded 24 hours later because I didn't respond exactly how I think I probably should have, right?
Yeah. Which is another good thing to go back and say, I was wrong, right? They need to hear that once in a while.
They do.
Because we're not perfect, right?
I have to do that a lot.
You apologize a lot, Cory.
I really do. I do that act. Like, I'm actually pretty good at that, but I think that's come out of necessity,
We've talked about that before. Maybe that's a learned trait.
Yeah, maybe it is.
Oh, no, I like that. When you were saying that, I thought of an experience when I was a young man. I was 21 years old. I hit this point where I was showing off for my girlfriend in my mom's GT Mustang. And I downshifted, hit a wet spot on the road, and ended up with the front wheels in the gutter and the back wheels on the sidewalk. And it had jack standed itself on one of the back wheels. And, differential fluid all over the place. Everybody was okay. But I was just down the street from my house. This was my mom's dream car, and I had wrecked it. And I called my dad and I said, I've been in an accident. I'm just down the street. And he came down and he looked at everything, saw what was going on, looked at me and asked if I was okay. I said, yeah, I'm fine. And he grabbed the keys and he threw the keys on the sidewalk and turned around and walked off. And there was a church real close there, and he walked around the church, gave himself 10 minutes, because I could only imagine what my dad wanted to say to me at that point. And he came back, and to this day, he handled that same way. He's like, if I don't excuse myself, I'm going to say something that I can't take back. And I'm going to give myself some time to think about this before I respond. I've always respected him for how he handled that situation. And I've used that a couple of times, thinking when my kids have made me upset, throw the keys down on the ground and walk around the church. That's kind of what goes through my head. That lesson that my dad taught me 20 years ago.
That's a great lesson. And man, he was a smart man, because you're right. In the moment, we say the tongue is a sharp sword. I mean, it really is. It cuts deep.
Yeah. So I love you, Dad.
Shout out to my mom. When I was 16, 17, you were telling that story and I was a bear. So poor mom. I wanted to ask you, Jim, you mentioned that you have some kids getting married now.
Yeah.
I'm envisioning this discussion, especially I'm going to have with the boys who ultimately might marry my girls. Right. And it's going to be I've been taking notes from other dads who've gone through that. So any advice from a point of view of, hey, you're about to marry my daughter talk. Did you have those talks, and what did you say?
This young man came to me and sat down. It was an hour and 20 minutes. Unfortunately, because of certain callings I've had in the church, I've dealt with a lot of divorce and things like that. And so I've seen what destroys marriages firsthand. So this poor young man, he got both barrels for sure. And he is a phenomenal young man. And so if he listens to this, little shout out. Great kid. I'm glad he's marrying my daughter. But I asked the hard questions, all of them. Started with communication, because I think that's the biggest breakdown in marriages is communication. And unfortunately, we stare at our phones and things like that and think we're communicating, and we're not. We're not having interpersonal communications. Talked about how you spend a lot of time with people at work. Okay, we talk about that members of the opposite sex, and then pretty soon they're giving you marital advice, which has no merit. Told him if he gets in an argument with my daughter, I don't want to hear about it. If you both want to come together for advice, I'm all in. We'll talk.
That's a great rule too.
But I don't want one or the other coming and saying, hey, and then you just start parting ways. You start getting differences of opinion, and the work thing. You spend 8-10 hours a day with members of the opposite sex, and you become good friends. But then pretty soon there's a line crossed, and it's such a hard to see line. But it's like, well, my son's doing this. What would you do? And then pretty soon, 6 months later, oh, my husband's doing this, and I'd never do that. And pretty soon you just, in a couple of years, you could be way off course, right? So we talked about stuff like that. We talked about intimacy, and he was squirming in his chair. I mean, at the end of the day, I have some things I feel really strongly about. If he ever makes my daughter feel uncomfortable, he's out of line. If my daughter ever made him feel comfortable, she's out of line, right? Pretty simple. Had a big discussion about pornography. Ask him when the last time he saw it. I mean, this is how I feel, right? I mean, this is my daughter who I love more than life itself, right? And I'm handing her off to somebody who is invested some time in her. I get it, but not the time I have. Right?
Yeah, not even close. It's a good way to put it, actually. Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, we went on and talked about work. I don't care what your job is. If you lose your job, pick up a shovel. There is a job to be done, and you will provide for her, period. Those types of things. And this young man he understood and agreed and in concept with everything. Plus he shared some insights of his own. It was really impressive. But at the end of the day, I would have felt remiss if I didn't have that conversation, because I want him to understand exactly how I feel about her and the situation.
Well, and looking back, like that's going to be good for his relationship with your daughter, but what a neat thing to build a foundation of your relationship with your future son-in-law that, hopefully is a 50, 60 year.
I'm hoping. Yeah. As long as I'm around.
Right?
Anyways, yeah.
But to look back and say, this guy who's going to be my father-in-law loves his daughter, but he also cares about me. That's a cool foundation to build that relationship on.
It was really funny. He, afterwards he met my daughter, she wasn't there. And she said, well, how did it go? And he says, your dad really loves you.
Which is true.
Message received.
Which is true. Yes.
Well, you're setting expectations, right? Which is a good thing to do with any new relationship in business and in family. But the reason I ask that question is I'm not sure there is a bigger decision to be made in your life than your life partner, right? And so I ask myself, and my kids are a little bit younger, my oldest is 16, but that means could be not that far off.
Not that far away.
Right? So I think it's important that we really think about, hey, I'm going to tell you what it means to me for you to be a gentleman to my daughter. Absolutely. I think it was Curtis Bennett who said, he kind of ended this same conversation, a little bit different, but similar conversation with, look, if you don't take care of her, don't worry, I'll come right back in. I was like, that's a good ending to that.
Yeah. At the end of the day, when they're building their relationship, it can't be exactly like mine or your guys' or anybody else's. But I also don't want the outside influences. I don't want social media. I don't want friends telling them how their marriage should be. They have to figure it out together. Mm-hmm. When you do that, the foundation's so much stronger because you built it together. You're both vested in it and you both believe in it, right? Yeah. If somebody else tells you how to do it, they're either crazy or then they're the law, right? And that could be bad too because one size shoe doesn't fit everybody.
Yeah.
So they got to build their own.
So we're kind of talking about foundations today, which I kind of like how this has gone. What are some of the foundational principles that you thought were most important to teach your children, and how did you teach it to them?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I probably failed them in a couple areas. I should have spent more time on money management, to be honest with you, because when I was young, I was brought up, you don't go into debt, period. The only thing you're going to go to debt for is a car and a house. Okay, that's the philosophy my dad lived by. That's the philosophy he instilled in me. Today, it's a lot different. Everybody's worried about credit reports and all these things and go buy this and how's your credit report and get it boosted and do this and then you have something, right? It's kind of funny because the other day I went in, it's been a little while, about a year ago, I went into the bank. They said, well, your credit's just average. I'm like, yeah. And? But to them, it was a big deal. I wanted to put a few $100s on a card for my daughter when she went on a mission. They said, we got to run a credit report on you. I was like, so she has a line of credit of $1,000. You need to run a credit report on me. Yeah. And because I don't deal in that world, right?
Yeah.
And so I should have taught them a little more on money management. And I'm not going to fail at that because now as they embark on their lives, they're going to be hearing all about it. But that's something I should have done better. But the most foundational piece is honesty. If you could just go back to what you got to teach them, you got to be honest and accept the consequences. Sometimes it's going to be great consequences. Sometimes you got to face the piper, right? At the end of the day, it might not work out so well. There may be a punishment attached or something else, but you got to be honest with people. If you're not, what do you have, right? I still believe a handshake means something, and my kids believe that too. And I want them to continue to believe that because all you have is your word. So that's probably the most fundamental piece that I'd like to instill with them because the rest will work itself out.
Yeah, I like that. We tell our kids all the time, you're free to choose, but you can't choose the consequence.
Exactly. Well worded. Parenting's fun, though.
Yeah, it has its challenges sometimes, but for the most part, it's the greatest thing ever, right? You mentioned that you always knew that you were loved by your parents. Mm-hmm. And my guess is that your kids know that too. What's the ways that you have shown them love? Or maybe an easier way to say it is, how did you build relationships with your kids? How did you bond with them? And how do you now?
Yeah. And that's a simple answer. It's time. I mean, not to just make that a really generic one-word answer, but at the end of the day, that's what's important. And that's really what's missing because we all get so caught up in careers. We get caught up in everything we're supposed to do. And then when we get home at the end of the day, it's like, holy mackerel, I need some time for me to unwind, right? And I'll tell you an interesting story about my wife. She's one of the greatest people that walks on this earth. I couldn't say anything bad about her, even if I tried. She's awesome. But we were fairly new in our careers. We had 2 little ones, and I love March Madness. Okay, it's just something I really like. And I remember coming home one day and all excited. I turned on March Madness, and I was sitting there, got a bowl of popcorn, and I was watching the games. And I made a comment to her. I said, "Man, if we didn't have TV, I'd spend more time with the kids." That was the comment, right? Back to popcorn in the game. The next night, I came home to watch the games, hit the button, snow, nothing on the TV. Like, oh, something's wrong. Cable's out. She's like, "No, you told me to cancel it." I said, I don't remember that conversation. This is March Madness. I'm going to have to go to the neighbors. She says, "No, you said if we didn't have TV, you'd spend more time with the kids." So I canceled it. We had 8 years we didn't have TV in the house. It was awesome. So while they were growing up, we didn't have TV. We did other things. And she was so smart to do that. It was awesome.
Yeah, not many people have done that. I've actually debated it.
We did it.
Did you do it? And would you both say that, man, you just said it was one of the greatest
You don't
decisions.
miss it. I didn't miss a thing.
And now you're engaged, right? If TV was something that you were already into, you're more engaged with the kids.
Yeah. Once the kids got to the point that you could really interact with them, like when we were bottle feeding twins, I watched every episode of How It's Made at 2:00 in the morning that there was to watch.
That's a little different.
But once they got to the point that you really start interacting with them, we decided that there wasn't anything on TV anyway. So if we wanted to watch TV, it was going to be a movie as a family or something like that. We don't have the over-the-air broadcast stuff even on our TVs, and nobody misses it. I heard one time, like you walk into a family room and you see where all of the chairs are turned and what they're facing. And I realized that ours were all facing the TV. I was like, we don't need a TV in the family room. The family room's for family. So our TV is downstairs.
Yeah, that's where ours
is. You don't see a TV if you come into our house as a guest.
Same with us. 100% agree with that.
So.
Yeah, we have a couple house rules like that. Phones, they can only be in the kitchen and family room area. They can't go downstairs. They can't go upstairs, especially when they're young kids. I'm here to tell you. The other thing I would say, and not to just throw out a whole bunch of advice that way, but things I've seen, is if there is anything in the house that can connect to Wi-Fi, your kids know about it and you forgot about it because it's an old phone that you discarded or an iPad that you upgraded and you threw it in a drawer. They know about it. You got to be really careful because if you're not teaching your kids about stuff, someone else is. And at the end of the day, I grew up and I was taught don't run with scissors because you'll fall and hurt yourself. Now we hand our kids cell phones that are 1,000,000 times more dangerous than running with scissors, and we say go. I mean, I have to ask my kids, and I have for years, how to turn on the computer for crying out loud, right? And so it's just a situation where we've got to be really careful. And the home is the sanctuary. In my opinion, it should be a sanctuary where everybody should feel loved and not judged, right? We talked earlier, and I'm going to revert back to that, but talk about making mistakes and admitting when we make a mistake. I am in no means the perfect father. As a matter of fact, I had a situation recently where my daughter came to me and we had to talk about struggling with some anxiety things that have been debilitating us at some points. And I'll probably break down talking about this because this shows you how big a mistake someone can make. Well, it started in about 4 years ago, and she just came up and told me about it now. And here I thought I had this great relationship, open, would talk about anything. But guess what? About 4 years ago, I made a comment, and I said, the word anxiety doesn't mean what it used to, and a lot of kids hide behind that. When they don't really have anxiety, they're just nervous. I mean, I believe in anxiety. Trust me, I know that it's a real thing. And some of it needs to be medically treated and everything else. But a lot of kids will, that makes me anxious. I'm not going to do that. And I'm like, no, that's nervousness, right? So I made that comment. I never thought twice about it again. Well, when my daughter started feeling this way, she's like, I can't go to my dad because he doesn't believe in it. That's what she heard, right? You want to talk about your world falling out from under you, right? So for 3 or 4 years, my daughters thought she's broken or she has a problem, and she couldn't come to one of the two people that love her most in this whole world, right? Huge mistake that I made. And it wasn't even the words that I said so much. It was that what she heard. And man, we got to be careful because those kids are listening, right? So you talk about a project like this, a gentleman project, where you're trying to teach people to be better. They're going to listen to those words. But what words do we inadvertently say on the side that they pick up? I mean, you got to be careful. Like this has caused me a lot of grief, especially the last couple of weeks. And I mean, tears shed and big, long talks with her, and we're getting everything worked out. And at the end of the day, it's great. But one sentence taken out of context, holy mackerel, and changed the course of someone's life.
Yeah. And you can't catch all those. The reality is you didn't mean anything by it. You would have never had her keep that from you. You know,
Exactly.
you didn't, in some ways, you didn't actually make a mistake. You just said what was on your mind and just happened to be bad timing. Right? But at the end of the day, I think that goes back to constantly asking our kids, you know, even if the relationship's great and you talk about everything, you know, continuing to do those deep dives. And you said, hey, one of the number one things about a marriage is communication. That's the number one thing with the kids too.
Amen.
It's the same things, right? And it's us with our kids. My wife's definitely better at that. Like my kids talk to her more. And I guarantee it's because I haven't had your 48-hour rule.
It was 24 hours, but if you need 48,
I might need 48.
72 for you.
72 for me. Yeah. A week.
by that point, it probably wouldn't be a problem anymore anyway.
Yeah.
Right. Well, my wife would have worked it out by then.
Yeah.
But no, I think it is important to think about what we're saying, how we're saying it, kind of giving them our vision of how we see the world, whether that's right or wrong. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in business, we oftentimes ask people to restate.
Yeah.
Right. All the time. What did you understand from this? What's your expectation? What are you going to go do? How many times do we ask our kids to restate after we've had a pretty critical conversation with them?
That's a good habit.
Yeah. I like that.
Well, I did it one time that I can remember, and my son, he was young. It was the bird and bees talk. He came to me and I was like, oh, it's time. And we were sitting in my old Chevy truck in the driveway and we had this whole talk. I explained everything. We walked in the house. My wife looked at me and she said, you just had the talk. I saw you guys sitting out there. I said, yeah. And I sat my wife down in the living room. I sat my son down and I looked at my son. I said, now explain to her everything we just talked about.
There you go.
And his eyes popped out.
I bet they did.
He didn't want to, but guess what? From that point forward, they had an open discussion. And anything like that, he could go to her or me. It wasn't this is a dad thing, this is a guy thing. It was, I could go to whoever. And so
That's powerful.
Yeah, and it was an accident. I mean, I did it on the spot. I didn't pre-plan this. I just walked in. I thought, I don't know if he's got it all the way, but when he explains it to her, I'm going to know exactly what he understood. Because either I'm going to teach him about it or his buddy is. And quite frankly, I think I know a little more than his buddy. So.
Yeah, that's exactly the words I've used with my boys. Like, you're going to learn this stuff from somewhere. I would rather you learn it from me. And if you have questions, don't ask your friends. They don't know.
Yeah.
They don't know any more than you do. I had an interesting conversation. I was thinking about this when we were talking about communication and having some of those maybe blind spots with our kids. I was having a conversation with a young man on Sunday, and I just said, what's the number one thing right now that is a challenge for you? And he had just started the 7th grade. And he's like, man, people speak differently in the 7th grade than they do in elementary school. And I really struggle with it, like the language that people use at school. And I said, yeah, it's different, isn't it? I said, do your parents know about this? And he goes, no, I haven't talked to them about it. And I said, I challenge you to talk to your parents about the number one thing that's bothering you right now. And he's like, it's a good idea. I think I'll do that. Right. So how often do we ask our kids, what's their number one challenge? Because what that does is it just leaves the door wide open for them to talk about whatever's on their heart. And it could be something completely out of left field that's going to blindside us that we'd no idea about. But that's a pretty powerful open-ended question. It's like, what's your number one thing that's bothering you right now, or that you feel it's a challenge for you?
Yeah. And I would even add to that, sometimes you have to ask the question, you or your friends, because a lot of times those kids will speak through their friends. Well, I got a buddy who's dealing with this. And you're like, oh, well, tell me about that.
That's a good one.
Because if you add the friends in, there's a safe space. So that's a great point, though. I mean, that acceptance, young adults right now, acceptance is huge, right? If you don't get enough likes on whatever post you have, they get frustrated. And that just scares me too, because they're basing their happiness on what other people think. And we've been taught for years. You know, your real friends are your real friends, and it doesn't matter what other people think. And, you know, I've always taught my kids, and I just want them to like who they see when they look in the mirror. You should be happy. You smile, flex, right? You know, I'm almost 50. I still throw down a flex once in a while. You guys know what I'm talking about. Don't pretend you don't. But at the end of the day, that's if you don't like what you see, then there's a problem. And the first people you should go to are the two people that love you the most on earth, and that's your parents. And hopefully you have that relationship, right?
And if it isn't your parents, which usually it is, but if it isn't, you look for those mentors that you talked about before that you can talk to, right? I think you said it takes a village or an army or something to help you raise your kids. You know, we've talked in the podcast before, you know, talk to a coach. Maybe you have a basketball coach or a soccer coach or whatever. Talk to a church leader if you have church. You know, talk to a grandparent. I think for any of the kids that might be listening, you know, talk to someone that loves you, that cares for you.
That's the key. Someone that loves you.
Right.
Someone has a vested interest in you. Because anybody else will throw their opinion.
Yeah.
There's someone that needs to care about you.
The other thing that I think that they need to understand as part of those critical conversations are if they've made a mistake, that doesn't make them a bad person. It makes them a normal person. And as soon as they grasp that, I made a mistake, I've got to fix it, I don't know how, and I'm ashamed of it. As soon as they feel shame, then it's their secret and they don't want to talk to anybody about it. But if you just open that door and say, hey, just so you know when this happens, because it's going to, and you're going to make a mistake, it's easy to fix as soon as you're not ashamed of it anymore. And you know that you can come and talk to me about it, we'll fix it.
Oh, I love how you worded that. A lot of times, you know, these kids get a little dent in the car, and then sometimes the parents, that's all they focus on is the dent. Okay, you've been looking at pornography, and they check with them every day. And so that's not the car is still in awesome shape. Let's fix the dent and let's focus on the car. You know, a lot of times I get the opportunity to work with youth. We talk about windshields and rearview mirrors. I mean, you make a mistake, that's great, but let's look forward. And if you compare it to the rearview mirror to the size of the windshield, I mean, 98% is awesome. You use the rearview mirror to check on it once in a while to make sure danger doesn't sneak up behind you. But let's go forward. Let's quit dwelling on that. You see kids today, it's so hard to forgive them. So they got this perfectionism running around. And I don't understand that because I made mistakes so much. You know, I did the best I could. Let's move on. It's different. And I don't know why it is, but they look at everything on the line and it's got to be perfect. And then their life, it's got to be perfect, you know. And yeah, I didn't grow up that way. I was happy with B's and C's, right? All right, rock on, right?
And now look at you.
Yeah.
I think their identity is something that we've talked about before that's important, and explaining where their identity ought to come from. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about in the past of thinking of your identity as a slices of pie, and asking your kids, well, what percentage of that identity should be social media, do you think? Which is mostly fake. Probably not much. Not saying there isn't something there. I'm not saying it's not real. Just saying that should be a pretty small slice of your identity, right? The rest, let's talk about the rest of your identity. And your identity isn't your mistakes. That's right. The bump in that's the teeny little thing. You're the entire car, as you put it, right? That dent doesn't define who you are. You're this huge, amazing person.
Yeah.
And these little minor things should not identify who you are.
But we've all been those youth, though.
And I've been that person, yes.
We've been those people, and we said, this mistake defines who I am. And because of that, I am just who I am with that mistake, because there's no fixing me.
Well, we still do that. And I think we all have to have, like, I believe in a divine identity that we all have, right? And I know you guys do too, but regardless, even for adults, right? Our identity shouldn't be just work.
Right.
Nor should our identity be just our sports or our church affiliations or our whatever. And I think that's important to talk to our kids about is where should your identity come from? Yeah. Right. And defining that and helping them understand that. And they're not defined by their mistakes. They're not necessarily defined by their wins either. Right. They've got to have a core ideology of what it means to be human, what it means to be part of your family, of what it means to, you know, what their purpose is on earth, kind of a thing. Then you can go from there, and then you can talk about the mistakes in relation to that, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, we talk a lot today we talked a little bit about social media and the importance to these youth. I had an experience where I went over to Ghana to do a humanitarian project with my daughter. And in that, I was a parent leader. And it's a 19-day thing. There was 19 youth. We got to Atlanta. We all met up. We're getting ready to get on the plane, and they take all their cell phones. They cannot have cell phones for 19 days. They're going to focus on serving the people of Ghana. We were building a school. It was a really cool program. So I take all their cell phones. I put them in a bag, and I lock it, throw it in the suitcase. They're done, right? It was interesting because as the kids started interacting together more and more, the friendships, the relationships that were formed, it was incredible. It was just awesome. But what I found most interesting is when we flew back to Atlanta, now kids are going all over to their home, whatever state. I unzipped the bag. We open up, here's your cell phones. Okay, there's 19 kids. 4 kids grab their phones. They're dead, right? Because they haven't been used in 19 days. Run over and find an outlet charging them. They cannot wait to get back to this. The rest of the kids stuck them in their carry-on bag and said, I think I'm going to wait till I get home. I don't really want to leave this. I would rather sit. And they sat in circles waiting for their flights and played games and did all this stuff. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. You know, we think they're addicted to this. They're not. And when they get away from it, they don't really want it. They really don't. And that was eye-opening to me.
I need to talk to my daughter more about that. She doesn't have a phone because it was a penalty for some things that she was having struggles with, right? And it's been a long time now. It's been like 6 months. She hasn't had a phone. And she's 16. So for most 16, well, she's almost 16. For most 16-year-olds, that'd be a big deal. After the first like 3 or 4 months, I'm like, babe, don't you want your phone? Nah, not really. I'm fine. I don't really need it. I was like, oh, that's great. To your point, she kind of had this aha moment. You know, other than communicating in order to get together, I don't think she misses it that much. She doesn't act like she does. I need to have a deeper conversation with her. So why don't you miss it? What do you miss? What don't you miss? Because it'd be just out of curiosity, you know?
Well, even like when I say 20 years ago, I didn't have a cell phone. My kids look at me like, what? What are you talking about? You didn't have a phone. How did people get a hold of you? Like, they called on the home phone. And
if it was busy, they called someone else.
Right. And I was talking to my boys who are now texting with girls. It's like, you've never even had to have the dad phone call where the dad picks up and you say, hey, is so-and-so there? And yeah, who's this? Well, click.
Yeah,
like
that's awesome.
I had to talk to her dad first before I got to talk to her. Like, that's a gatekeeper moment. I like that. I think we should bring that back.
And we talked about pornography a little bit and the dangers of that. My kids have been approached with drugs recently at school. And I think it doesn't matter what school you go to, that exists. Yeah. And I'm talking anything from marijuana to cocaine to vaping. I don't care what you want to throw out there, like minor to major. Were you approached with that? Did you have that talk with your kids? Did it never come up? Did they decide that's not something they wanted to do? How did you guys approach that conversation?
That's a great question. That was never one that we struggled with. We educated our kids just on the dangers and allowed them to use their agency. And that wasn't something every kid has their struggles.
Right.
That just wasn't one. And I don't know if it's because we started pretty young on educating on the dangers of that maybe that just got ingrained of, hey, this is potential for a big pitfall. But for us, that wasn't really that big of a challenge. Other things, absolutely, but not drugs or alcohol.
What were some of those things that you guys dealt with that were bigger challenges?
Time management. And that may sound funny, but I'm telling you, if you have free time, you get in trouble, right? Time management. You have to have things to do. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, so we made sure our kids stayed active so that they didn't have, I love free time as long as you're doing something productive. I think Denzel Washington said once in a speech, a commencement speech he was given, just because you're doing more doesn't mean you're doing, I can't remember how he worded it.
I've watched that. It's
more
incredible,
to the positive.
actually.
It is incredible.
It's really good for those who are listening. Yeah. That is a great commencement
just because
speech.
you're doing more doesn't mean you're doing more productive or something like that. And that is so true, right? So time management and letting friends dictate how they feel. That's something that was something I had to deal with quite a bit of. Yeah, the social acceptance and how friends can do that. So that's a challenge.
It's crazy how friend groups can change the personality of your child.
And you notice it.
Yeah.
And that is something that we actually dealt with when we were kids. We had the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like whatever friends you're around, you're going to become more like them. But it's pretty hard in that moment when you're a teenager to even see how that's affecting you. It is in a major way. So any thoughts on how you approach your kids? Like if your kids were hanging around with maybe not the greatest friends, or like, how did you discuss that with them?
Yeah. So for me and my wife, it was simply having them come to the conclusions, right? So we can steer a child to a decision, but we need to make it their idea at the end of the day. And it's their agency to finally make it. But if mom and dad just say, hey, that's not a good person, and here's why, or what they're doing is wrong, mom and dad can be crazy, because later they'll go to school, well, your parents are crazy, and they don't know, they're old, right? But at the end of the day, if you sit down and talk to your child and say, how do you feel about this? What are your thoughts on this? And they come to the conclusion just because you steered them a little bit with a couple leading questions, all of a sudden it's their idea, their plan, and they're vested. Right? Yeah. And that's in my opinion, that's the difference.
That's good advice.
We've had a couple of things lately where I've had to say, I'm really trying hard to look at this from your perspective. Will you try to look at it from mine?
From mine. Good point.
And that's one of those questions that you can say, now, how would you feel if you were the dad here? And then it becomes their idea, and they can say, oh yeah, maybe that's not the greatest idea. Man, what a cool podcast this week.
Great podcast, Jim.
I mean, jam-packed full. I'm not going to have any problem listening to that 3 or 4 or 5 times. When we end the podcast, Jim, we always ask our guests what they think it means to be a gentleman. Would you like to answer that question for us this week?
Yeah. What I think it means to be a gentleman is to think of other people and put other people first for a period of time during the day. And it doesn't have to be all day. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. It's not all day, but if you take a few minutes out of the day to think of how you can make someone else's life better, if you can just look at that kid at school that needed a high five or something else, and you put yourself out there and not focus on yourself. I call it taking a vacation from yourself, right? I think kids need to do that. I think even us as parents, we need to do that. We need to take a vacation from our problems and think about somebody else. And guess what? Your heart changes, your mind changes, and your perception of life changes, and you become happy. And when you're happy, it's easy to be a gentleman. When you're not happy, it's a challenge.
Now that's a good answer right there.
I'm going to take a vacation from myself. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this week. Jim Burwell, thank you so much for spending the time with us. That was a fantastic conversation. Thanks for providing the value to all of our listeners this week. If you like this podcast, please like, share, subscribe, drop us a review. That sure helps. Downloads are looking awesome. So thanks for sharing the podcast with your friends and just being a part of what we're trying to do here. I'm Kirk Chugg.
And I'm Cory Moore. Thank you so much for listening, and continue to keep raising ladies and gentlemen.